Hello again. Let's talk about graphic narratives. In this lecture, we're going to look at the exploding phenomenon of the superhero following Superman, and we're going to examine the impact that had on the comic book industry. To begin with, very soon after people saw the numbers of the Superman sales, they quickly rushed out and began copying the idea. And very soon we saw superheroes of every stripe and color donning these acrobatic outfits and going off to defend against injustice. This phenomenon was so overplayed at this time to such an extraordinary degree that within the industry they had the euphemism the Long John hero, because they seemed to be running around in their underwear. Because really, if you think about the costume of a superhero, it's not like there was anything that could actually be like that tight fitting. This is long before people actually had these sort of skin tight outfits that are so common today with these synthetic fabrics. In fact, to show somebody in that with their well-defined musculature, they're really almost naked. And yet we see that. And there's this way in which their clothing is just so tight that at the time, no one could really make a costume that quite worked that way. And so what we see is what Michael Chabon called a secret skin. It's time to propose or confront a fundamental truth. Like the being who wears it, says Michael Chabon, the superhero costume is, by definition, an impossible object. It cannot exist. And he goes on to say, what is the role of this costume? What is the purpose of this clothing beneath their clothing? They say it is to hide and create a secret identity, to adopt a series of cloaking strategies to preserve it. But what we are actually trying to conceal is a narrative, not who we are, but the story of how we got to be that way, and by implication, all that we lacked and all that we are not before the spider bit us. And I think this is a very important idea about the costume of the superhero. It's this really striking way in which the character is transformed. And the transformation itself is so spectacular and wonderful and a little bit kinky, the way Superman can just toss off his clothes and become this amazing superpowered being. And this is the thing that was so attractive at this time. One of the early imitators of Superman was Will Eisner, who was working for Vicente Fox as a packager. Again, he was making content that would be sold off to any publisher who was looking for content to publish. And Will Eisner knew this was really close to Superman, and he seemed to have balked initially at the idea, but he was doing work for hire. And Vicente Fox said, nah, it'll be fine. Well, very soon, Harry Donenfeld, the publisher at DC, he went around and started suing people with sue and desist, stop and desist orders, claiming that their superhero infringed upon his copyright for Superman. And thus began a whole long series of legal battles. Wonder Woman actually, court case went to court. And in this case, the judge ruled very strongly against Wonder Man, saying it was an infringement of the copyright of Superman. And bolstered with that victory, we see Donenfeld going after publisher after publisher. He knew ultimately he couldn't stop people from making superhero comics, but he was going to slow them up. He was going to make it difficult because he was making a fabulous amount of money and he didn't want any competition. Donenfeld had been a publisher of those kinky pulp fiction magazines, Spicy Detective and Spicy whatever. And he was glad to be out of that business that was being persecuted as pornography, and was really trying to clean up his new publishing business by creating more, quote, legitimate publications of higher standards. And he really tried to wed Superman to the American dream and everything about it. Very early on, as we see in this comic here from 1940, Superman would join the battle of the forces against fascism. But it was really always a kind of lopsided battle. Superman could just sort of jump across the Atlantic, grab Hitler and Stalin and take them off to the international court, and that would be the end of the war, which wouldn't actually be the end of the war because real soldiers were dying every day. So Superman during the war was not really put into employ battling fascism in Europe. He was instead brought back to the United States, where he continued to fight crime and sleeper cells of other ne'er-do-wells in the United States. Superman was a radio show. Within a few years of it coming out, it was a newspaper, published weekly and then daily. It was an animated cartoon by Max Fleischer that was some of his best work. It was really spectacular animation. And it was during this animation that Max Fleischer came to them and said, this jumping around that he's doing doesn't make sense. We should just make him fly. And it was that in those stories that Superman began to fly. And in the radio, he just seemed to be so powerful, there was no weakness. And so in the radio drama, they had this idea of kryptonite. And so it's in the radio that we first hear about kryptonite. But certainly I remember growing up seeing Superman on TV. Reruns of reruns, I assure you. But it was still a very popular program. It ended suddenly in 1958. George Reeves, who played Superman, had committed suicide with a gunshot wound, and they immediately canceled all further productions. And for many years, there were no more Superman TV shows until like the 1980s. It was a difficult job to play Superman. George Reeves was a very gifted classical actor, and he took his role very seriously. But he found, having played the part, he could never get another job to play any other role. Anything he did, he was forever branded as the Man of Steel. So with all these different residuals coming out, Harry Donenfeld was becoming fabulously wealthy. And Siegel and Schuster were working at DC, and all their friends were saying, wow, you guys must be rich. Yeah, all that merch that's coming out all the time. And they were looking at each other going, well, really, not so much. We've got a job. And we don't own Superman anymore, which was a hard, bitter pill to swallow. Because if you recall, right at the beginning, they had sold their rights to DC Comics for $130. And then it was 1947, and they were no longer getting as much work from DC Comics. And they were a little worried that they were going to get kicked out and the better jobs are being passed up to younger artists. They were sued to regain the rights to Superman, which they did not win that because they had officially sold it off early on. But they did get some control over Superboy, which then they sold back for some money to DC. In the 1950s, because they had sued DC, they were blacklisted from the comic industry. And then the 1970s, just before the Christopher Reeve movie came out, there was a lot of bad press and hullabaloo about these two artists, Siegel and Schuster, who invented Superman, who were living in poverty. Finally, 1998, Siegel Estate files for termination of the sale of the copyright through changes in the copyright law at that time. In 2010, DC countersued the estate of Siegel and eventually wins in 2013. All of these battles have gone on for years and years and years. At this point, it looks like DC owns Superman outright until 2033, when Superman will eventually, inevitably, enter the public domain and anyone can make a Superman comic. Batman was conceived shortly after Superman. Bob Kane saw the sale numbers and said, hell, I got to get in on this, and went home and began thinking about some kind of superhero. He wanted to create somebody who wasn't or didn't have a superpower, but was sort of like an inventor, like Leonardo da Vinci, and maybe had like ornithopter wings, and he would have like a secret identity, like a bat. And so he developed this idea. Now, Bob Kane was not a great artist, but Bill Finger, his friend, was a good writer, and the two of them came up with this idea, and it took off. Now, initially, Batman was a very dark character. He was this wealthy millionaire who was trying to avenge his parents, and he had a cruel streak. And in some cases, he would even shoot his opponents with a gun. Eventually, as Donofrio was trying to clean up his act, he pulled Batman back from being such a dark and miserable character, and he gave him a sidekick, the boy wonder Robin. And this was the first attempt at kind of softening the image of the superhero with this kind of boy attached to them who would be what you're supposed to identify yourself as. This proved enormously popular, and then right away, all superheroes would have sidekick young boys who would follow them into the battle. It was at that time that Donofrio, in his many efforts to clean up his comics and to become more respectable, hired a guy by the name of Dr. William Moulton Marston, who was a bit of a huckster, and he would go out. He was, a professor of psychology, but one who had always been a little bit sensational. And he was invited to come in as an advisor to DC about ways that they could improve their comics. And he came back with a proposal. You need more female superheroes. Because as he would write later, not even girls want to be girls, so long as our feminine archetype lacks force, strength, and power. And this world, he really sincerely believed, would be a better world if it was entirely run by women. And so, using his wife and their mutual lover as inspiration, he created Wonder Woman. And this feisty character was an immediate sensation. And those three, Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, have been the most popular superheroes in DC ever since. Wonder Woman was a very curious character. She wasn't the first character to be a female superhero, but she was one that was decidedly in a very different mold from other superheroes. She wasn't just a female version of a guy type of superhero. She came from this culture that was different. It was a female-centered culture of Amazons, powerful women, and they had different ways of seeing things and doing things and different rituals. And this would come up from time to time in the comic. As you see here, they talk about instead of Christmas, they have the Feast of Diana. And Apollo, the sun god, he drives his flaming sun chariot through the sky. And so this is the way in which, we really see her as this person who really belongs to this different world. It was a really ingenious idea. Wonder Woman was very popular on the battlefield, and she was quickly spun off to her own comic here. And she was very clearly a feminist icon from the get-go. Marston really wanted to create something that women and girls especially could look up to as a role model. And to me, that is a really admirable and extraordinary thing in the early comics history. The other great patriotic character to emerge at this time was Captain America. Writer Ed Herron, penciler Jack Kirby, who would go on to extraordinary fame in the comic world, and the editor Joe Simon. And you can see here, this was first issue of Captain America. He's going right after Hitler, and he was very much a military character. Now, if you'll notice, his shield in this episode is not a circle, which is what it's known for. But it was this actual, more like a shield shaped. But there was another superhero at this time who had that shaped shield, and they told them to stop. And so Captain America thereafter was given a round shield. There were all kinds of crazy and ludicrous and outrageous superheroes. One of my favorites was Phantoma, the mystery woman of the jungle, kind of mixing superhero with jungle adventure. Fletcher Hanks was a really curious artist who had this strange art style with these men with these really thick necks and these strange musculature. And then he had this language which was really very crude and basic but urgent. And this is the way in which I think comics were really popular at this time, was they were kind of crazy. They were sort of outrageous. They weren't like Donafield's creations, which were all trying to be so mainstream and so well drawn and with good grammar. They were kind of edgy and strange like this. The one superhero who really gave Superman a run for his money was Fawcett Publications' Captain Marvel. Now, of course, if you're not familiar with this history, this might be confusing. You've probably seen some movie where Captain Marvel was a woman owned by Marvel Comics. But no, in the beginning, Captain Marvel was a guy by Fawcett Publications, drawn by C.C. Beck. Really, really good artist. And he was given good pay for his work. And so the quality of the drawing was superior. Captain Marvel really outsold the hero Superman. And in this, you have this basic premise. The boy, Billy, says Shazam, and he becomes this adult. It's a great idea. It's a really very original concept where the boy's sidekick transforms into the superhero. Now, if you're looking at this Captain Marvel #1, you might be thinking, well, that looks a little similar. Well, of course it does, because it's just another superhero throwing a car in the very same direction. And it wasn't long before DC Comics went after Fawcett Publications in what has to be one of the longest drawn out legal battles over copyright superheroes in the history of comics so far. Captain Marvel spun off into all kinds of different subsidiaries and merchandise, and it took them a very long time to figure out who was copying who, when, where, and how. There was the whole Marvel family, and then there was the whole Superman family. In the end, Captain Marvel's popularity began to wane, and Fawcett Publications would just quit the whole comic industry. They decided, we're done with this. So in 1952, they admitted defeat and sold off all their presses and their characters. Eventually, and strangely, and I can't completely explain all this, Captain Marvel, the name gets sold to Marvel Comics, but the character gets sold off to somebody else, the appearance of the character. They get separated. And so the character's appearance eventually gets repurchased by Marvel much later and becomes known as Shazam. Anyways, someone else with more time could explain the whole story better. Will Eisner, his name has come up quite a bit. He was not really into superheroes. No, in fact, to be honest, he hated them. He thought it was really tacky and not much fun to draw. He wanted to create an art comic, and he got his break in 1944. Newspapers, which had been hurting because of the popularity of comics, had decided to put a comic inside their own pages. Not only would they have their Sunday color supplement, there would be an additional publication, which would be a comic book that would come out every Sunday. And this was a tall order. They needed someone who could really put it together, someone who had a notable track record of always being on time. And this description fit Will Eisner to a T. And he said he wanted total artistic autonomy. And he did. And so he came up with this character, the Spirit, who is just a guy in a suit, right? And initially they were balked at it. They were like, well, it's just a guy in a suit. We need something we can sell, something we can market. We want something that makes him stand out. And so in a nod to their concern, he painted a little black mask on him. And so this is the way which the Spirit came about. And Eisner really was fascinated about making the page tell the story, how to break up the panels, how to have faces pop out in the middle of panels, different ways of using the story, circular frames to build excitement and action. And the drawing was really top-notch. He was an exceptional artist. And he really started to explore what could be done in a comic book, unfettered by the sort of daily grind of so many other publishers. The Spirit really transformed itself. Each week was a very special and different work of art. In the theme of the circus, we had the Pagliacci, the Killer Clown, a story based on an opera. And here the Spirit goes after a clown murderer. And he always liked to start his first page of his comic in a big, bold way. The clown holding a scepter with a skull on it, grinning back. And this way in which he got your attention, this became known as the splash page. So we can see here in a typical Eisner comic, he's decided to mix up the frames. Notice the way he's used circles across the two-panel spread, the way he's got the face of the clown underlit, glooming, looking from the shadows. There's a whole lot of film noir sort of conventions that he's using to try and create suspense and drama. He was really interested in the film noir, and he wanted his comics to be the kinds of works of art that people would look back and admire. For all the work he did on developing his visual style and his stories, he really left the characters in the dumps. He had some absolutely horrible caricatures, even for the time. This Ebony White character, who was just a really horrible step and fetch it caricature, continued to grace his pages long after most people had moved on from those kinds of representations of African Americans. So when we look back at a Spirit comic, you can see the fascination and obsessions that Eisner had for all things dark and mysterious. He loved rain and drips and wet surfaces, and he filled his pages with them. He was not that interested in speech bubbles, and he always called them a desperation device, as if they were sort of a last resort in telling the story. The story really should be, first and foremost, a visual experience. And he did a lot of work with telling the story in this visual way, without words, hoping that his body and his expressive anatomy and his use of gesture and caricature could really dramatize the action in the scene and tell the story just like a silent strip. And he was really inspired by a number of artists who were working in silent comics at this time. Their names were Franz Massariel and Lynn Ward.